Okay, good morning. Time now, 1 minute past 8 a.m. In Japan Standard Time on November, I think November 12th. Sorry, November 20th. Sorry, I'm now in Washington, D.C., so I'm mixing up the time differences. So once again, November 20th in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo, currently sitting in Washington, D.C. Every spring and fall, 6 regional chief economist offices of the World Bank put together the regional economic outlook with the depth analysis of the different topics focusing on each regions. In case of Middle East and North Africa, the office put together the report on the October 16th, which is about a month ago. Every time our seminar is trying to feature all of those regional economic office, chief economist offices economic update. Today is the final one that we feature the Middle East and North Africa region. With us connecting from Washington and also Italy, by the way, we have 3 economists with us from the Office of the Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa region. We have Jessica Torres, we have Nelly Elmalka, and also Gianluca Mele. The 3 of them will be presenting the report for the next 30-40 minutes. Then we are going to read the question that we received in advance and then ask the 3 speakers to respond and then make a comment. Then if you didn't have opportunities to send your question in advance, please send your question using the online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar, or you can send your question directly by email to me, or you can post your question on the chat screen of the YouTube so that I read your question on your behalf. So now I would like to invite Jessica, Nelly, Gianluca to present the latest edition of the Middle East and North Africa Economic Update, October 2024 edition, titled Growth in the Middle East and North Africa. So Jessica, please come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koichi. Thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning to everyone. I'm gonna open the conversation now on behalf of the team, and let me share my screen. Here we go. I think it works, correct? So the title of the October 2024 edition of the MENA Economic Update is Growth in the Middle East and North Africa. This is an effort led by our chief economist, Roberta Gatti. And on behalf of the team, here is with us Nelly Elmaleh, an economist in the MENA Chief Economist Office, and Gianluca Mele, who is lead economist for the West Bank and Gaza. And we also, part of the team, we have Diego Faurez, Menatala Musa, and Ilya Subanov. And this morning, Nelly, Gianluca, and I will be presenting the main findings of the report. We take this edition of the economic update looks at the challenge of growth in the region. Over the past 50 years, there have been improvements, significant improvements in standards of living among developing oil importers. In this figure, we are showing the cumulative growth since 1970, and we see that GDP per capita increased by a factor of 3 among developing oil importers. But when we dig deeper, this is driven by 4 countries in this group, while the rest of developing oil importers have moved in the opposite direction. Among oil exporters, whether developing or countries in the Gulf, what we see is that compared to 1970, GDP per capita has barely improved. And right now, average GDP per capita in the region stands at only 25% the level of the frontier. To close this gap and reach 50% the level of the frontier, GDP per capita in the region would have to grow at an average rate of 3.8% per year over the next 30 years. But when we take a look at what's been happening, we see that among oil importers, growth in GDP per capita has slowed down. We see that in the first panel in this figure, where the average growth rate in GDP per capita from 2010 to 2019 among developing oil importers is only 1.3%, a significant slowdown from the decade prior, and way less than what the region needs. And among oil exporters, which we observe in the next two figures, growth remains highly volatile, and in the case of oil exporters in particular, has been negative over the past 10 years. So what can the region do? And that is what we look at in this edition of the Economic Update. Nelly will walk us through the short run macroeconomic outlook, and then Gianluca will present an update of the situation in the West Bank and Gaza. Nelly then will cover the economic consequences of conflict over the long run. What tends to be the impact in standards of living of conflict, and then I will come back with some areas of opportunity, areas of untapped potential that the region has. So Nelly, please, over to you now.
Jessica, and thank you, Kosti, for having us today. Good morning, everyone. So let us begin with the macroeconomic outlook for the MENA region based on what our country economists are projecting. So the big picture is that real GDP growth is expected to pick up a bit in 2024 from 1.8% in 2023 to 2.2% in 2024. If we look at this in per capita terms, this translates into a slight improvement in standards of living from a real GDP per capita growth rate of 0.5% to a real GDP growth rate in per capita basis of 0.9% in 2024. Now you can see that this is significantly lower than the 3.8% that Jessica outlined earlier, which would be needed to catch up to halfway to the frontier over the next 30 years. Next. Now, real GDP growth forecast for the MENA region in 2024 has been substantially downgraded over the past year. So according to the October 2023 forecast, which was made earlier by our country economists, real GDP growth in the MENA region was supposed to stand at 3.5% in 2024, which is significantly higher than the 2.2% currently projected by the macroeconomic and poverty outlook. Next. This 2.2% highlights a broader issue in the MENA region, which is the issue of chronic low growth. It's significantly lower than the pre-pandemic average observed in the MENA region, which stood at 3.3%. And in turn, this 3.3% is significantly lower than what we saw for other emerging markets and developing economies over the period between 2010 and 2019, where real GDP growth stood on average at 5.5%. Next slide, please. The slight uptick in growth that we see between 2023 and 2024 for the MENA region masks important disparities within the region. It's primarily driven by high-income GCC countries, which are forecast to experience an acceleration from 0.5% real GDP growth in 2023 to a 1.9% real GDP growth in 2024. This acceleration in GCC countries is primarily driven by the expansion of the non-oil sector in most GCC economies. On the flip side, growth in developing MENA countries is expected to decline from 3.2% in 2023 to 2.4% in 2024, And that's because the conflict impacts directly some countries and exacerbates pre-existing vulnerabilities in others. Next, please. For both GCC countries and developing MENA countries, they are going to experience lower real GDP growth than previously anticipated. For GCC countries, the October 2023 forecast stood at 3.6%, as opposed to the current forecast, which stands only at 1.9%. And this primarily reflects the extension of OPEC plus oil production cuts and lower than anticipated oil production levels. On the flip side, for developing MENA countries, we also see that real GDP growth is significantly lower than previously anticipated by 1 percentage point. And that reflects different factors and primarily reflects a reassessment of the effects of the ongoing conflict that the conflict is having on those economies, in addition to rising geopolitical tensions and rising uncertainty along with global conditions. Now we have just spoken about rising uncertainty, and certainly many of you have heard about rising uncertainty in the MENA region in the aftermath of the conflict in the Middle East centered in Gaza. In this edition of the MENA Economic Update, like we have done in the April 2024 Economic Update, we use a novel measure of uncertainty, which is basically the degree of dispersion in real GDP growth forecast by private sector forecasters for the median economy. In this slide, we are looking at uncertainty in 1 year ahead real GDP growth forecast between January 2015 and the present. And this measure allows us to capture the degree of disagreement among private sector forecasters and to have a monthly measure of uncertainty for high-income countries depicted by the green line, emerging markets and developing economies depicted by the gray line, and the MENA region depicted by the red line. So the higher the dispersion in private sector forecasts, this means that there is higher uncertainty and to some extent reduced confidence in these forecasts. Now we would like to highlight three main takeaways from this figure. The first one is that you can see that uncertainty in the MENA region, which is presented again by the red line, has been consistently higher than that observed in other emerging markets and developing economies, and also high-income countries. If we look at what happened after the onset of the conflict in the Middle East centered in Gaza, we see clearly that uncertainty in the region has been increasing, which contrasts sharply with the downward trend that we see in both emerging markets and developing economies and high-income countries. Importantly, as of September 2024, by this measure of uncertainty, we see that uncertainty in the MENA region is twice as high as that observed in other emerging markets and developing economies. Now over to Gianluca, who's going to present the impact of the conflict on the Palestinian economy, as well as the regional and broader global impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, and good morning to our audience in Japan. It's good to meet you virtually, and I appreciate your interest in this report and in the MENA region. What I'm going to do is a focus on the conflict, specifically in Palestine, and on the effects, on the regional effects of this conflict. So next slide, please. So what you see in this slide is a zoom basically into the Palestinian economy specifically. We have three trend lines. We have one for Gaza, one for West Bank, and one which represents the average, the weighted average for the Palestinian territories overall. Unfortunately, it's a negative story. We are 13 months, more than 1 year into this conflict, and the Palestinian economy essentially is nearing economic collapse. Basically, it's an economy in free fall almost. And as you may know, we are also facing a humanitarian crisis, very historic humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So what you see in this slide is the Palestinian territories, the light green trend line. You can see that there is a massive drop in 2024, at the beginning of 2024. The latest data that we have is for the first half of 2024, where we know that the economy dropped by 34%. I want to say this is, by the way, the largest contraction ever recorded in the last 3 decades in the Palestinian economy. I want to focus on one aspect. There is a big difference in the type of shock that we're dealing with. In Gaza, we have a supply side shock. As you can see on the screen with the darker green color, that is Gaza, there is an 86% contraction in the first half of 2024. So an absolutely massive contraction. It's basically the economy halted, or it's a near complete halt of economic activity. And this is mostly because there are no supplies entering, there is no goods entering Gaza at the moment. That's why a major supply side shock. I don't have the time to go into all of the details, but for example, CPI, the level of prices in Gaza right now has skyrocketed at roughly 280%. Foodstuff, specifically food, is costing roughly 300% more than it cost 1 year ago in Gaza, and so on. This is because of the supply side. So there is a pent-up demand for very few goods, and this is explaining why also this level of inflation. In the West Bank, instead, we have a demand side shock. There's not such a problem on the supply side, but the main problem is that people lost their jobs. These people are Palestinians who used to work in Israel, and their working permits have been essentially canceled when the conflict started. So as these people don't earn an income anymore, and these used to be, by the way, some of the bigger earners in the West Bank comparatively vis-a-vis the local salaries, as these people do not earn anymore their incomes, the demand, basically the aggregate demand in the West Bank has dropped, and as a consequence, consumption has dropped, and so growth has dropped. So it's a very different type of shock between the two. This is on the real sector side. Again, as I said before, we don't have the time to in this quick presentation, but there is also something going on the fiscal side. We don't have a slide for that, but there's a massive fiscal crisis going on in the West Bank and Gaza. The financing gap for this year is nearing $2 billion, which is almost 3 times the gap of last year of 2023. And this is affecting public service delivery because essentially the government doesn't have money to pay for basic services. And by the way, they started to cut public salaries lately. Since the start of the conflict, salaries are paid, public salaries. Think of doctors, teachers, and policemen, and so on. Roughly 60 to 70% of the commitment basis. And then there's a problem with the financial sector. The financial sector remains solid, but the risks are increasing importantly. If there are questions, if any of you have specific questions on any of these issues, I can come back to that. Next slide, please. Now I would like to move instead on how the other MENA countries have been affected. I don't know if it's me, but I still see the same slide.
I can see, I can.
Very good. Now it's working. So it's a story as we move away from the Palestinian economy into the regional economy in terms of what are the impacts of the conflict at the regional level. It's a story of very limited impacts, especially if compared with the gravity of the economic impacts that I just described. So the effect on individual countries depends mainly on the level of economic ties between that country and the geographic epicenter of the conflict, so the Palestinian economy or the Israeli economy, and also simply the geographic proximity to the conflict zone. So in short, we see a limited impact if you look at the region globally. But then there are specific countries like Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan that are more affected. Egypt in particular is more susceptible to balance of payment crisis, to balance of payment challenges. And this is something that precedes this conflict. As you may know, there were disruptions in the Suez Canal, in the marine traffic in the Suez Canal. At the same time, instead, the tourism, for example, has been another channel of contagion. In Egypt, relatively resilient, but both Lebanon and Jordan instead have experienced a very significant drop in tourists' arrival as a consequence of the conflict. And for both countries, the tourism sector is a cornerstone of the economic growth. Let's move to the next slide, please. If we move a little bit more at the higher level, so we're going from, Palestinian economy, regional level, and now we're going into the regional/global level by looking at commodity prices, basically. We also do not really see, any real impact through the commodity prices, especially when we look at energy commodities. This is obviously somehow good news for the regional economy, but it's also a symptom of the fact that there are very limited linkages between the MENA economies. So the economies are not really regionally integrated very much, which is not necessarily a good thing. So both the energy, now here we see just the commodity prices, but also the financial sectors basically demonstrated a good level of stability in the face of these shocks related to the conflict. There was a little bit of initial volatility when the conflict started. But if you look at the oil futures in these slides or the gas futures, basically they have remained stress-free. They have remained relatively stress-free. And actually, they have experienced a decline since the beginning of the conflict. So this is a story of resilience on this front. Next slide. The last channel of transmission that we studied is the one related to the Suez Canal. As I mentioned, as you may know, there have been some increase in the tensions in the Suez Canal related to the Houthis in Yemen that started to attack also commercial ships. So there has been, the consequence was basically an increase in the spot prices for shipping, both regionally and globally. And you can see here in the World Container Index, this is the figure on the right of the screen, and also in other freight rates, for example, the Shanghai to Genova rate. In some cases, 4 or 5 times, the rate is 4 or 5 times higher than it used to be at the end of 2023 before the conflict. So there is definitely a significant increase in the spot prices. However, we really do not see an effect on the prices paid by the end consumers. This is for a number of reasons. First of all, because contractually, many of these rates for the shipping industry are long-term, in many cases 1, 2, or 3 years old. So in that case, this is kind of buffering the consumer goods from the spot market volatility, you see, because it's already in the contract from before the conflict. There's another reason. Since COVID-19, the global supply chains have learned a lesson and have learned how to be more resilient and more adaptable. There was a massive, as you may remember, massive crisis right after COVID-19. But for example, in this case, when it comes to shipping, the fleets are significantly larger than they used to be only 5 years ago. So that definitely helps. And finally, let's not forget, we have been in a global context of relatively modest growth. Interest rates have been historically high. Now they're slowly kind of coming down, but global demand is subdued, essentially. It's modest. So in that sense, there is no strong demand-supply imbalance when it comes to these kind of shocks. So definitely that also helps. Next slide, I think I will hand over to Nelly for a study on the long-term impacts of conflicts on the region.
Thank you, Gianluca. So the effects that we have discussed so far highlight the near real-term impacts of conflict in the region. And what we do in this report is that we take a step back and look at these events from a longer-term perspective. So we rely on data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, and we see from these data that there has been an increase in both the frequency and the severity of conflicts in the MENA region over the past decade. We see that the current conflict in the Middle East centered in Gaza highlights a broader trend of escalating violence in the MENA region. Based on our analysis of these georeference data, which cover all individual events of organized violence between the 1990s and 2022, we find that in the MENA region, which is presented by the red color, there has been a significant increase in the total number of conflict episodes between the 1990s and the present, from an average of 20 conflict episodes in the 1990s to an average of 52 conflict episodes starting from 2010. And also we see that there has been a six-fold increase in the share of global fatalities, and the share of regional fatalities as share of the global total in the MENA region. And again, we see that the increase has been by 6 times higher. So from a 6.4% of the global total in the 1990s to approximately 40% of the global total starting from 2010 to the present, and precisely in the period between 2012 and 2018, the MENA region had the highest share of conflict-related fatalities as share of the global total compared to any region in the aftermath of the Syrian civil war. Next slide, please. Now, what we do in this report is that we ask what are the long-term consequences of conflict on conflict-affected countries in the MENA region. We rely on a synthetic control method, which allows us to estimate what would have been the standards of living in MENA countries that are affected by conflict in a hypothetical scenario where conflict would have not occurred. So to construct our counterfactual, we rely on the weighted average of standards of living in synthetic control countries, which are basically countries that mimic the treated country, which is the country that is affected by conflict, based on a set of pre-conflict observable characteristics. However, these synthetic control countries have not experienced conflict during our period under consideration, which in this case we limited to 3 years before the onset of the conflict and then 7 years after conflict's occurrence. Our counterfactual estimates suggest that income per capita could have been on average 45% higher in conflict-affected MENA countries 7 years after the conflict occurred, had the conflict not occurred. So this is a hypothetical scenario where we try to come up with an estimate of what would have income per capita been in those countries affected by conflict. Now, clearly, this is a very large impact, and this loss amounts for approximately the gain that has been achieved in the MENA region over the last 35 years. Next slide, please. So these estimates that we presented in the previous slide are based on selected conflict episodes in the MENA region. For example, we include in our analysis the 1992 Algerian Civil War, the 2003 Iraq War, the Second Intifada in the West Bank and Gaza, the 2011 Syrian Civil War, as well as the 2011 uprisings in Yemen, which culminated in the 2014 Civil War. We see particularly that our estimates are very large for Syria and Yemen, which means that they incurred substantial losses after the Syrian civil war and the Yemeni crisis, respectively. We estimate that income per capita in Syria could have been on average twice as high 7 years after the conflict occurred, as opposed to what we observed 7 years after the conflict. On the other hand, for Yemen, we estimate even larger losses, so income per capita could have been even triple in the absence of the Yemeni crisis, which started in 2011. For Algeria, Iraq, and the West Bank and Gaza, we estimate that income per capita could have been anywhere between 15% and 27% higher 7 years after the onset of these conflicts. Now, clearly, these losses are very large, which highlights how important peace is for sustained economic development for the MENA region. In fact, persistent conflict, as we can see from these figures and from the counterfactual estimate aggregating all these 5 case studies, can undo decades of progress and set back countries in achieving sustainable development objectives. Yet despite these challenges, there is a significant untapped potential in the region, and Jessica now is going to present what are the key levers of growth to boost innovation and to boost growth in the MENA region over the long term. Over to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thanks, Nelly. Am I unmuted now? I think, yes, you can hear me, correct? Yes.
We can hear you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So we start this exercise with a diagnosis. We want to identify what are the potential levers that the region can use to boost standards of living. And this methodology is called a development accounting. We invite those that are connected to visit the website, to read the report, so you can see more on the methodology, the challenges, the technical challenges of implementing these, the needs in terms of data requirements. But basically, what this exercise does, it separates differences in GDP per capita from the frontier, in this case, the United States, which is the standard in the macro development literature, into differences in physical capital, differences in human capital per worker, differences in how this human capital is used as captured by the employment to population ratio, and finally, a residual total factor productivity or TFP. And so this exercise helps us answer, are these differences driven by factor accumulation? Is it that countries need more physical capital, for example, or is it driven by the way these resources are being used, which is measured by aggregate productivity? And so what we find in this exercise is that between 60 to 80% of differences in standards of living are driven by differences in employment and differences in the way resources are being used in the region. And so, in other words, what we find is that low levels of employment and low levels of total factor productivity is what is driving the low levels of GDP per capita in MENA. And we then are going to look at how to increase these two components. And for employment, we specifically look at gender employment gaps. And for aggregate productivity, to boost aggregate productivity, we will look at the role, the size of the public sector, and how to increase innovation. In terms of employment, what we find is that employment rates in developing MENA countries, that is the whole set of countries excluding the GCC, are one of the lowest in the world. In Egypt, for example, the employment rate is half the rate that we observe in the US. In the GCC, these rates are much higher because of migration, but low employment remains a big challenge for developing MENA. And this is driven in particular by issues with female labor force participation. The MENA countries exhibit one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the world. We can see that in this figure where we are showing the gap between the male rate of labor force participation and the female rate. And what we can see is that even compared to income peers, these gaps are the highest. This gender gap is one of the highest in the world. In light of the enormous gains in human capital over the past 50 years, this low rate of participation is a suboptimal use of talent or a misuse of talent. In this figure, what we are showing is how years of schooling and index of years of schooling changed in some MENA countries over the past 50 years, and what happened to employment rates in that period. And what we see is that as years of schooling was increasing dramatically across the board, rates of employment remained flat. And so our quantitative exercises, what we find is that if more women were to be incorporated into the labor force so that the gender gap would be closed completely, gains in the typical MENA country, for example, a country like Egypt, would be about 50%. This is an enormous potential that remains to be tapped in MENA. In terms of productivity, what we find is that aggregate productivity, or the way these resources, human capital, physical capital, are being used in the region, is low across the board, even among the GCC. So for example, looking at in this figure, what we are showing is levels of aggregate productivity relative to the frontier. And so for example, Tunisia, the gap is 50%. Saudi Arabia is still 25% below the level of the frontier. And so to close this, we look at both the way resources are misallocated between the public and the private sector, and what happens in terms of knowledge and innovation. The region employs one of the highest share of workers in the public sector in the world. In this figure, we are showing the share out of everyone who works, the share that is employed in the public sector. And so the average for the region is 22%, which is in the third panel in the figure, which is 4 percentage points higher, for example, than ECA, which is Europe and Central Asia, the second highest share. When it comes to women, however, the MENA has almost twice the level of ECA. So the average is 36% in MENA. And in ECA, it's only 22%. And it's very important to point out that this average doesn't include Algeria or Iraq, where the share of women in the public sector exceeds 60%. And we can include them in this figure due to lack of comparability in the data. And so if few women participate, and when they participate, they tend to not go into the entrepreneurial, the private sector, the sector that tends to be more dynamic, then that is a suboptimal use of talent. A large public sector may not necessarily be detrimental for productivity when the goods and services that the public sector offers are very efficient and effective in boosting private sector productivity. But what we find in the report is that the public sector might not be that efficient in delivering productivity enhancing goods and services. In this figure, we have on the horizontal axis, the share of employment in the public sector relative to the OECD average. And on the vertical axis, we have an index of quality of infrastructure, again, relative to the OECD average. And so, for example, a country like Algeria employs maybe 2.5 times the level that we observe in the frontier in the public sector, but the quality of public services delivered is 40% less than the level of the frontier. And that is even among countries that are effective in delivering high quality infrastructure, such as the UAE, they do that with a relatively large share of workers in the public sector. And so this suggests that there are gains from moving some of this talent away of the public sector into the entrepreneurial private sector. And that is what we find in our exercises. What we find is that if talent were to be optimally reallocated or into the private sector, gains of productivity would be 5% in Iran, 8% in Egypt and Tunisia, 9% in Jordan. And for comparison, in this literature, these are substantial gains. These are huge gains in productivity. Even though it might look like a small number, it means a lot for standards of living and compared to other potential distortions to the private sector. And gains, of course, would be significantly higher in Algeria and Iraq due to the fact that they have more than about 2/3 of women in the public sector. As we explained before, low aggregate productivity can also be due to a lack of innovation or low quality technology that is not putting businesses at the frontier, and what we find is that there's evidence that in the region that seems to be the case, and that seems to be one of the drivers for the low levels of TFP. In this figure, we are showing an index first of the quantity of knowledge produced in the region. And we see that relative to the frontier, this is very low. So the region doesn't produce knowledge. This is an index of the number of articles per capita. So we are already controlling for the size of potential innovators. And so, for example, Qatar is at 50%, the level of the frontier. The second highest, Iran, is 45%. So still a long bridge to close. And this knowledge on top of that doesn't seem very impactful in terms of citation, in terms of the way the community, the scientific community is using this knowledge. And we see that in the right panel. Here we are controlling for the size of the potential innovators in a country with population. And we see that many developing MENA countries are below average. And even the largest economies like Saudi Arabia or Iran are still very far compared to population peers, compared to countries of comparable size. And so there seems to be opportunities to increase productivity by generating better knowledge, by tapping on the frontier of knowledge and ideas. And something that we cover in the report is how one way of doing this is through more international trade. Trade has been shown to help businesses adopt technology and bring knowledge from other parts of the world. And what we document there in the report, and again, we invite readers to, the audience to go and download and see more evidence there. What we find is that the region is not performing optimally when it comes to exports, and especially non-oil exports. And so to recap, growth remains fragile in the MENA region. Conflict, as Nelly showed, dials back development, and so we need to keep that in mind in light of the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank that Gianluca summarized really well. But MENA has opportunities to boost standards of living with peace as a foundation. Peace remains critical. There are opportunities to increase growth through a better talent allocation in and out of the labor force, and also between the public and the private sector. Innovation is another way of increasing productivity, and given the strategic geographic location of MENA, there's lots of potential there to to exploit. And finally, and it's something that because of time I didn't have time to cover, data transparency remains also critical because it helps with the diffusion of ideas and knowledge that can potentially come through international trade. So we're gonna stop here. Koichi, over to you, and thanks again. We look forward to your questions and suggestions. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica, Gianluca, and Nelly, for your presentation summarizing the main findings of the latest edition of the MENA Economic Update. Thank you very much. We did receive some questions in advance, so let me read those questions. Those questions came from Sasaki-san. Thank you for your question, as always. Let me read the first two questions together and then ask the team to make our responses. The first part of the question was this: what would be necessary for MENA governments to help and enhance the private sector in the region, which is the main driver of creating more jobs? And the second part of the question is this: to enhance the private sector growth, do technologies have roles to play in the region? What about education at different levels, which would build the labor force with quality? So I'd like to invite the team to come in and make some comment and responses. Thank you.
I can try to answer on behalf of the team, and then perhaps Gianluca or Nelly can come in and complement if I'm leaving something out. So I think like we covered, the region has a lot of potential in terms of innovation. Through more international trade, the region can tap in the frontier of knowledge and technology, and this is one of the ways where we can close this gap in productivity that will in turn improve standards of living. We do not go into specific policies. In terms of the first question, we invite everyone to connect back in April, where Koichi, if we come again to present the findings of the April economic update, because we will cover there specifically how to boost the private sector. How can the private sector become more dynamic? In this report, specifically, what we are doing, we are looking at a more big picture. How is it that a large public sector, by not allowing businesses, by stealing talent that could form businesses, how that in a big picture is being harmful to productivity and private sector? But in April, we are gonna take a deeper dive on education. What we find in the development accounting exercise, I like this question because I didn't have time to cover that in the presentation. What we find is that in terms of the average level of human capital, MENA is comparable to other emerging markets and developing economies. The gaps there from the frontier, MENA is not an outlier, and as we showed, the region has done a lot to increase human capital. Where the region falls short is in how this human capital is then used for innovation, for private sector productivity. So let me stop here. I don't know, colleagues, please feel free to come in if I left anything out. Gianluca, Nelly.
Very quickly, I just wanted to just suggest to who asked this question, or in general, if the audience is interested, there is a report. It's not the one that we presented today. There is a report by the bank that was published a few years ago, I believe in 2019, but I'm not sure. It's called Jobs for Development, and it presents a framework to analyze exactly these kind of questions. So how do we create more jobs? To give you a sense, I think the question is very good because between 2024, between today and 2050, so in the next 26 years, the MENA region will have 300 million new job entrants. So the region will need to create roughly 300 million new jobs. It's a massive number. So it's a huge challenge. How to do this? Jessica mentioned it. It's essentially a matter of productivity. We need to increase productivity. And productivity can be analyzed across different dimensions, on the products level, on the education level, like part of the second question was referring to, or on the urban level, think of rural versus urban. It means that we need to push to move jobs from less productive to more productive areas. Now, it could be a long conversation, but if you're interested, go and check out that report. That will have more answers. On the education, I just want to mention, and there was a part of the question that mentioned technology. Technology, definitely, there is a very strong correlation between the firms that have a higher level kind of a more sophisticated technology adoption level. These firms exhibit higher growth rates in the long term. So definitely there is a strong correlation there. Over from my end. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gianluca, the report that you just mentioned, Job for Development, is it a MENA focused or is it a more global report?
No, it's a global report. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that information also. Okay. Let me continue with the question. The third one is this. How do you see the results of the elections in some developed countries affecting the geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics in the region in general, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza? What does the World Bank do to support the West Bank and Gaza? So perhaps I should invite Gianluca to come in to make the responses. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with this since it's probably angled more on the West Bank and Gaza. So obviously, yes, politics determine outcomes in life. This is a matter of fact. And obviously, elections in big economies, in globally important countries, determine outcomes. This is true. Now, while I'm not well placed to discuss the politics side of things, what I can say is that I do expect some changes in the future, and hopefully these changes are going in a direction that brings back growth, safety, security, and ultimately peace for the people in the region. As far as what the World Bank does in the West Bank and Gaza, we do many things, but around a couple of concepts, 2 or 3 concepts. First of all, we have been working on immediate relief support, kind of emergency support. We did it when the conflict started. There was a package of $35 million that was implemented through the United Nations. This provided roughly 500,000 food packages, helped with the vaccination of roughly 200,000 children, and so on. The main problem on that front is the access, the ability to access Gaza at the moment, which is not exactly always possible or in the way we would hope. This is the first part. The second thing that we do is a strong focus on reforms, on fiscal stability and reforms. I mentioned before in the presentation that the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian economy is facing a very important fiscal crisis. So what the World Bank does, we provide financial resources to the government of the West Bank and Gaza to pay basic services, essentially to protect human capital. To give you an example concretely, last month in October, we paid $80 million, and this is entirely grants. This is not a loan, it's a grant, to finance salaries in the education and health sectors, which basically means we're helping the authorities to pay those salaries of teachers, of doctors, nurses, and so on, in a way that basic services are provided, continue to be provided. And then we focus on a number of other things in the energy sector. For example, we're working on renewable energy sources. We're working on quality education. We're working very much actually also on solid waste management, which is a big problem in the West Bank and Gaza. I want to mention that it's not just the World Bank, and I will close here, but not just the World Bank, but also IFC and MIGA that have an interaction with the West Bank and Gaza program. IFC focuses specifically on priority sectors in the private sector side. They support small and medium enterprises. They support the digitalization of small and medium enterprises that, as we just said before, is so important for for linkages, to create economic linkages. We work with startups, for example. In Gaza especially, we have programs specifically for local startups. So it's a very diversified program, but in a nutshell, we focus on these three things: emergency support, fiscal sort of stability, fiscal reforms, and service delivery. I hope this was useful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. So you responded to the question that we received. So perhaps, any final words from any one of you to the audience in Japan?
I can just thank you on behalf of the MENA Chief Economist Office for the interest in our analysis. And if you want to talk more offline about some of the technical aspects of the different exercises that we did for this report, we welcome you reaching out to us. Thank you, Koichi. That's it, I think, on my end. Please, Gianluca Nelli, if you want to have some final remarks, go ahead.
Thank you, Koichi, for having us. And of course, we'd be happy to connect with any of the colleagues who have any specific questions. And we look forward to connecting again in the future. Nothing else to add from my end.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with us connecting from Washington and Italy, we had Jessica Torres, Gianluca Mele, and Nelly El Malak from the Office of the Chief Economist for Middle East and North Africa region, summarizing the latest edition of the Middle East and North Africa Economic Update, October 2024 edition, titled Growth in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you very much. We certainly will come back to you, the team, asking to present the next edition to be issued in April, focusing on the private sector, which is going to be pretty much interesting. So with that, once again, thank you very much. And then we are going to feature an interesting topic next week. We are going to have Hana Blixi, the director of the Gender Group, visiting Tokyo in person. And then we are going to have the event, actually session, to discuss the Soji issue on Monday, together with the Asian Development Bank and the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And also, I think it is going to be the Wednesday. Wednesday, we are going to have the forum on gender. Particularly, we are going to discuss the gender strategy of the World Bank, gender strategy of the Asian Development Bank, and what's the JICA is doing in terms of the gender equality. So these sessions will be held in a hybrid manner. We welcome your participation in person at the venue. Please check our website for the detailed information. So with that, once again, thank you very much, and then see you next time. Thank you.